Supply chains distorted by the COVID-19 pandemic mean opportunities to net some of the relocating multinational companies. This morning, we speak with representatives from the American and European Chambers of Commerce here in the Philippines to talk about foreign investments in the post-pandemic Philippines. John Forbes and Lars Wittig, thanks for joining us, gentlemen.
Good morning, Mimi.
Okay, so good morning. So I guess let's start with you, John. So the good news is we're getting a vaccine. There is hope. But before we even get there, how big of a risk is permanent scarring in the underlying Philippine economy?
Well, it's a pretty serious risk because the Philippines is losing time. With such a large GDP growth drop this year, and even if it can increase by somewhere the same amount next year, they're just going back to where they were at the end of 2019. Meanwhile, population growth continues, so per capita income by 2022 will be less than it was in 2019, and poverty will probably be increased. So that's certainly a scar. But other countries, particularly my country, the United States, are also suffering. So the Philippines is not alone in this situation.
And let's talk about FDIs. Because, you know, I imagine that investors, when they choose which countries to go to, will look at, you know, the economy, the fundamentals. Lars, you know, FDIs are shrinking. Globally, FDIs are down 49% in the first half of this year, according to UNCTAD, down 12% in Asia and 20% down in Southeast Asia. I think we have a graphics of this. I mean, Lars, what's the sentiment of investors? I mean, what kinds of conversations are you having with your colleagues in the chambers? I mean, do you already have members there that have already relocated? And I guess the ultimate question is, did the Philippines net any of them when they were moving?
Yeah, first of all, investors are looking for stability and predictability, and then there are the basic parameters where they will compare. They will compare on corporate income taxes, etc. So therefore, it's very important that that on a timely basis the budget for 2021 is being approved, hopefully before year's end by Senate. It is being handed over by Congress this month, it is expected, but also the bill of create will also definitely create the right KPI incentives and improvements so that we can remain competitive. As we all know right now, our income taxes, for example, are rather high relative to the other ASEAN countries. At the same time, a lot of the existing investors that might be considering, and some have even decided to move to other countries, it's because incentives that they were banking on have been removed or are being altered. And that is especially applying to existing investors in the development zones, export development zones.
So I guess, you know, what most foreign investors here want is to apply the grandfather rule, which is, you know, all previous setups will stay. Okay, okay, Lars, you jumped ahead there. So I guess I wanted to get the take of John. So John, from the unique perspective of the American Chamber of Commerce, the industry you belong to, what other critical measures do you think should Congress deliver? I mean, Lars already mentioned a few. What do you think are the critical ones as well to get the Philippine economy running, you know, significantly hotter than its peers? If you could pick one, is it going to be Arise? Is it going to be Create? Is it going to be Bayanihan 3? Is it going to be amending the 84-year-old Public Services Act, the Foreign Investments Act of 1991, or is it the Retail Trade Liberalization Act of 2000?
No, give me the option to pick them all. That's the way that you make reforms. Sometimes it takes 10 or 15 or 20 years, like the Competition Act. So there's constantly a menu out there. I think what is critical during a time such as COVID-19 and a pandemic is to accelerate the rate of reform, because we talk about a post-pandemic. Asia post-pandemic will be the largest GDP in the world, the largest number of consumers in the world. We're going to get back to Asia like that, and the Philippines is part of it. So we should take advantage of this time in the pandemic to accelerate reform. All of the ones you mentioned, and we have a longer menu with the Philippine business groups that we are working with the Congress and asking them to do in the last Congress, this Congress, and the next Congress. So we're optimistic that during this period there can be more reforms.
What are the chances, though, that these reforms, these legislative reforms, would be sidetracked because of the upcoming elections? I mean, 2022 elections is just around the corner, and there's always a timeline. 1 year before, nobody's moving.
I don't know. In my experience, that's not the case. The Congress actually, the Senate, for example, recesses traditionally about the second week of February for the campaign period. So that's shorter than a non-national election year when they go straight through. And there is that excitement of pre-campaign, et cetera. But it can be done. They're still in session, and it's a matter of leadership coming from the executive and the Senate president and the Speaker of the House. It can be done.
I think if I may jump in there, I mean, the biggest concern right now is to a very high degree the consumption, our domestic consumption. And we know in an election year, yes, for example, towards the final years of the former government, there were no new PPPs being launched towards the final months or even 1.5 years maybe of the former government. But private consumption tends to increase as we are approaching election. So, and that is really what we do need right now, that is to get the private consumption back up into gear.
Okay, so before we even head to the elections, let's bring the conversation back to today. I mean, we mentioned global FDIs are down. Philippine FDIs also down for the year. I mean, we get it. There's a pandemic, business is bad. It's nothing out of the ordinary. But here's the thing. Vietnam is zooming ahead. In fact, Vietnam is slightly down, not by much, not like the drops we're seeing. Realistically speaking, I mean, what's happening there? I mean, Lars, I know that you've got experience not just here in the Philippines, you have operations in other parts of Asia. What are you hearing when they compare Vietnam to the Philippines? Almost everybody's going to Vietnam.
Yes, and it is Vietnam that is the big competitor when it comes to looking for alternative sites for manufacturing in particular, and whether it is investors that sadly might be leaving the Philippines, or in particular those that are relocating from even China and looking for just new sites for manufacturing from especially Korean and Japanese investors. And actually John is much more specialist on this area than I am. We have both lived and worked in Vietnam, but he even speaks the language. But
you do, John? Oh, okay. Okay. So I guess what's Vietnam doing right?
Well, first of all, they're competitive, more competitive. My favorite example is Nike. 500,000 Vietnamese work for Nike, and the last Nike factory in the Philippines moved to Vietnam over a decade ago. We certainly have 500 million Filipinos, I think, would take jobs at Nike. Cost of manufacturing is labor is the same between the two. But we have twice as many paid holidays here, and the cost of electricity is subsidized in Vietnam at 30% cheaper. So if we can get the cost right and the logistics right, the first super container ship just docked in a Vietnamese port, according to Nike. That's a super container. You have to have super exports to get one of those ships to dock, and that brings down the cost of shipment to the market in North America. So we need volume. We need to get exports up. We definitely need the crate to be friendly to the existing investors, and we'll find that out in the next couple of weeks. We support the amendments that Senator Recto has been proposing, and are optimistic we can get a consensus around them. And then we want to go forward. DTI is launching a new investment promotion for new manufacturers to come into the country this week, and we want to get behind that and make it happen in the Philippines.
Okay, just very quickly, so far from January to August, FDIs here in the Philippines amounting to just $4.4 billion. That's, 2017's record $10 billion FDI feels like a lifetime away. When do you realistically expect we go back to that level, to the $10 billion levels?
I would say it could happen, or it could happen almost instantly if the right laws are being passed and budgets approved within the next 8 to 10 weeks. Predictability is ensured, that we don't create any uncertainties, actually the opposite. It is 4.4 billion. It sounds like a big drop, but it is not that far from where it was a few years ago only. The 10 billion, that was a huge, giant leap up. That was, I mean, we even had one May 2 years ago where we had higher FDIs than Thailand. We are generally moving at such a low level that it is not difficult to double it up. I'm very optimistic that it will, that it can and even will happen. And there are many bright lights here going on. I mean, I really believe that starting with Christmas, I think in this country, Christmas is bigger than COVID-19. With the vaccine next year, absolutely. With the right regulations from the government and Senate, Congress, we will make it.
Okay, on that very optimistic note, Lars, John, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
In other news, the Philippine House of Representatives will seek to increase next year's calamity fund by at least 5 billion pesos to help typhoon-hit areas recover. House Speaker Lord Alan Velasco says there's a need to augment the calamity fund for 2021 since the lower chamber approved its version of the budget before typhoons Quinta, Rolly, and Ulysses wreaked havoc in the country. In the